This is an extract from the Leader Coronavirus Daily podcast by the Evening Standard and hosted by me, David Marsland. To hear the whole thing, search for it on your podcast provider. It's hard to keep track of the days, let alone school diaries, but it is the end of the Easter holidays. The summer term has begun. Those parents who had taken a break from teaching their own children are now being asked, although not obliged, to resume lessons. When, they might ask, will it end? And how, they may also wonder, can they make the best of things in the meantime? Our editorial column is thinking the same.
There is no clear answer to the first question. Mixed messages from the government have not helped. In Britain, it is hard to imagine schools reopening before June, and even then only some classes would take place. It will be the autumn before anything approaching familiar school life returns. So that makes online learning vital, but a survey by the Sutton Trust charity suggests only a third of children have taken part in online classes, and that private school pupils are much more likely to do so than ones in state schools. That's why we welcome the launch today of the Oak National Academy, the first online UK classroom. It's backed up with plans to give laptops, tablets and 4G access to families who don't have them. The BBC is providing a new education service too. It won't be the same as school, but while classrooms are closed, learning doesn't have to stop.
The BBC service will see people like David Attenborough teaching natural history, Ed Balls is doing an economics class, and the historian and host of You're Dead to Me podcast, Greg Jenner, is releasing a series on history, surprisingly enough. The first went out on BBC Radio 4 this morning, and he joins me now over Zoom. Greg, have we as a nation ever had to come together like this to educate our children before, like in the Second World War or maybe the Spanish flu epidemic?
Yeah, I mean, certainly during the Second World War, there was a genuine attempt to try and keep teachers in their roles. So teachers were exempt from military service, for example, and to try and maintain some sense of classroom community spirit. And you know, I think it became very difficult with the Blitz, and where children were taken out of the cities often and sent off to safety in the countryside. That became harder, but there was this awareness that you have to carry on with the education of children because it gives them comfort and reassurance, and also it's important. Education is what we value so deeply, and so even in the midst of a terrible war, you're still trying to plan for the future and make sure that young minds become adults. And yeah, I suppose we are now in a very strange moment, but the BBC, in their hour of kind of crisis, I think, have stepped up and gone, well, we can help here, and I'm hugely proud to be part of that.
I listened to the first one this morning, which is all about the Restoration and King Charles and all the chaos that came with that particular part of English history. What sort of things were you thinking about then? You kind of touched on this a bit, but what kind of things were you sort of concentrating on to try and make this a fun show to listen to as well as educational?
The tricky thing when you're doing history is that a lot of history is actually quite dark and quite nasty and violent, and you're trying to pick stories that are familiar, useful, accessible, but there are some stories that are, they've got violence in the centre of them, so we have to be quite careful tonally. But having done horrible histories for 12 years, I'm able to sort of, I think, hopefully judge where the line is. We know that kids love all the kind of gore and violence and poo and wee in the past, so you give them a little bit of that. But the challenge on this one is trying to produce a series that is not necessarily there to reinforce the curriculum, but at the same time can help teachers if they feel they need a little bit of a boost. We're not doing subjects that are specifically just curriculum based, but we are trying to do things which are often sort of first examined at roughly that age, when kids are about 7 or 8 years old. So we've, this morning done the restoration of Charles II. We've got episodes coming up on Mary Queen of Scots, the space race, Charles Dickens, Cleopatra, the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang. We've got the British Stone Age, so Stone Age Britain, what it was like. We're trying to sort of get around the houses a bit and do history all the way back to the Stone Age and all the way up to the 20th century. But obviously, with You're Dead to Me, my podcast for grown-ups, we can be much more global and a lot more broad. With kids, you've got to sort of, give them a bit more of a helping hand with just some of the more obvious stories that they might encounter anyway when they're growing up. So the choice was, how do we try and be a little bit more global than usual, but at the same time giving them something that's not too off the beaten track, so that it can be useful for parents and teachers.
Did you think about doing something connected to things like lockdowns or viruses, something like the Spanish flu?
From my point of view, I'm trying to move away from the thing that I'm finding it all very anxious. I don't really like waking up every morning and reading the news and just suddenly going, oh no, it's today's worse than yesterday. So I'm trying to, where I can, bring a little bit of joy and distraction, to be honest, from what's going on. I think there is certainly an angle of saying, well, look, there is a historical precedent here of pandemics and lockdowns and whatnot in some ways, but I think because so many children out there are probably scared and confused, and they don't know what's going to happen and when they're going to get to see their friends again, or when they're going back to school, and they may even know people in their family who are not very well. I think my job probably is to try and lift the mood a bit and give them something else to think about and give them some laughs. We've had some lovely tweets this morning from parents saying their kids were, one kid fell off the sofa giggling, and you kind of go, that's the best review you can get, is a child accidentally, well, hopefully not hurting themselves, but if a child is giggling, you go, yeah, okay, great, that's worked.
I think it's really interesting, really heartening how the nation has come together with education as a priority during this time, because children are away. So we have people like you making your podcast. Danny Dyer's doing history with the BBC. Ed Balls is going to be doing an economics teaching lesson. How unique is this time for us, Greg?
From a historical point of view, we are, there are certainly little moments that feel familiar, but from a wider point of view, this is a extraordinary moment. I've never really encountered anything like it. Obviously, the entire nation, the entire world has sort of gone into a form of protective stasis. This is obviously a huge challenge for teachers, parents, carers, anyone working in education. And I think we've seen already some incredible responses from all of these people, everyone trying their best to try and, keep some sense of normality for kids. So there is no historical precedent for the kind of existence many of us are living right now, because actually we're living in a weird little 21st century micro event that is a huge piece of history. It's going to, I'm sure, will change the course of the world, and I'm sure we will look back on it and go, wow, do you remember that 2020 was epic? But there's no real obvious comparison, because I can go back to Spanish flu, which is a devastating pandemic in 1919, but this is not that. It's our own little strange phenomenon that we have to deal with.
And Greg's new book, Dead Famous, which looks at celebrities from the Stone Age until now, is also out now. Search for the Leader Coronavirus Daily on any podcast provider to hear more from the podcast.